Some housekeeping before I hand it over to our panelists. There's a discount on the book, as you can see behind me. Please take advantage of that. The extensively revised and updated second edition of this book just published last week. And as I'm sure you'll see and agree after listening to the authors today, it's an excellent resource for anti-bias leadership in early childhood. So I'll drop this information in the chat so that you can access it when I'm no longer on the screen. This webinar is being recorded, and you'll receive a link via email in a few days' time. So please share that with anyone who may not have been able to join us today. There will be a Q&A, so please put your questions in the chat, and our panelists will do their best to get to them at the end of the hour. And last but not least, please visit the Teachers College Press website, tcpress.com. We have tons of resources for those working in early childhood and across other fields in education. Sign up for our mailing list to hear what's new, what we're up to, and to hear about future webinars like this one. So please visit us, tcpress.com. And with that, please welcome our panel.
Hey, well, I'm going to start out. I just wanted to add a few words to Emily's introduction. We do a little bit of marketing of our own because John and Debbie have produced a really wonderful film and Karina has been a contributor to that one also, called that. Where now I'm losing the. Okay. Reflecting on anti-bias education. And it's finally a film about anti-bias education work that really focuses on the kids' interactions with each other and with teachers talking about it. And so if you have a chance, please look it up. And you can find it on our website, which is Anti-Bias Leaders ECE. And there's a link to the film there that everybody can get a chance to see the film. Okay, so our webinar today focuses on the current political organized opposition to anti-bias education. And this includes banning books from schools, libraries, and classrooms, and stopping curriculum that includes anti-bias and other forms of equity and diversity education from pre-K to grade 12. It also includes punishing teachers in some cases who choose to practice equity and diversity education. So while this organized opposition seeks to stop our work, we also see it as an indicator that our work is having a positive impact. As Millie Almy, a pioneer in early childhood education, said to me many years ago, when the anti-bias education was experiencing an earlier round of organized opposition, she said, "Congratulations, you must be doing something right." But we thought it would be useful to take the time to talk about some of our experiences, both with anti-bias education and with opposition. One thing I wanted to just make clear that our discussion is not going to be about the kind of normal disagreements that arise either among staff or from a particular family about specific topics or strategies in anti-bias education. We see these as a natural process, as part of the process of building an anti-bias approach. And we also see them as opportunities for useful discussions and teaching moments to move our work forward. But we made a choice to focus in the hour that we have on organized opposition rather than on this normal disagreements or conflicts that come up. And one whole chapter in our book discusses strategies for turning moments of disagreement or arguing it into really productive teaching moments. So you can get a chance to learn more about our thinking about that particular issue through the book. So we'll get started. I'm going to kind of be the moderator. We'll be throwing out questions and panelists will answer. And then at the end, we're going to try very hard to keep a little time open for questions. And apparently you can put those in the chat. And we look forward to those. Okay, so the first question is, what do you see as one key achievement or success of anti-bias education in terms of your own work experiences? So Debbie, you want to start?
Sure. Thank you, Louise. And it's a pleasure to be here. And thank you all for joining us. When I thought about that question, to me, it's anti-bias education has brought to the forefront the research, the science, and the practice that early childhood is the critical time to talk about these topics, about identity, diversity, justice, and action. It's not too early. Children aren't too young. They're not colorblind. they do see those differences, and by 6 months of age, prefer same color faces. We know young children are observing and making sense of the world around them, and they're capable of identifying similarities and differences among people. They can recognize unfairness and understand that unfairness hurts. They can develop empathy and have the ability to stand up for themselves and others. And we've also all know that how adults respond to these children's questions and comments about differences will impact how children think about human diversity. And we've learned that being silent and ignoring those comments is still a response and gives children the message that either this topic we shouldn't talk about, or that it's not good to ask questions, and it leaves children to kind of figure out the answers themselves. So when adults pay attention to children's comments, their questions, and their feelings, and respond with accurate information appropriate to their developmental levels and experience, the children will get it. And adults can continue to learn from these children.
Thanks. Karina?
Hi, thank you for having me here today. For me, I feel like one of the greatest successes that I'm seeing as a center director here in West Seattle, Washington, is really having the teachers have that in their pedagogy now. I remember when I went to school back in 2004, we really didn't learn a lot about anti-bias work or the framework and how to really have that embedded within our curriculum. And now with my hiring of teachers and also supporting community colleges around the Washington area, I see that the pedagogy of anti-bias framework is really embedded within curriculum, within environments. And we know that there's a shift within our early learning world. So having our teachers be prepared has made it a lot easier, for example, for myself as a center director, to be able to support the teachers and the community, whether, it's through enhancing what they come with or giving them that extra support and not trying to convince them, but letting them know that this is what's really needed in our world of ECE. So to me, one of the greatest successes is having the teachers somewhat prepared when they come to us, or really them being open-minded about this work that is very important and critical in the world of early learning. The other piece that I see is that in my workspace, we have a lot of families that are invested in this work, and they're very open. And we have a spectrum of families within our community that are from here in the United States, or refugee families, or families from, moving from Mexico to here. And to me, it's really just that livelihood of them being open to the curriculum, to the understanding of sharing about each other and understanding the identity that we bring. And one of the things that I really like to work with and support myself, especially not being born here in the United States, is the sphere of biculturalism by Antonia Darder. And that's really understanding that that we play different roles here within our education, and we want to make sure we're doing that with the children that come in our center. So families are very open to that, as well as the teachers. So to me, that's one of the greatest success, is having that community feeling when it comes to working within an anti-bias framework and values within our organization.
John?
Yeah, I think I want to bounce off a little bit of what Debbie and Karina have said. First, for me, the first thing, just thinking about my own history as a teacher in the classroom, is anti-bias has moved us beyond this sort of dream of a bias-free approach, that somehow we were going to create a classroom that was free of all bias, and instead recognize that children are participants in a complex social world, social, cultural, and political world, and that they are watching and listening and trying to make sense of that world. So it sort of gets to that idea of recognizing the capacity and intelligence and curiosity of very young children to try and make sense of, who am I in the world? Where do I belong? Why are people treating me this way? Those kinds of things. I think the other thing that I would say with anti-bias education is this idea, and I think I draw this from Paulo Freire, that there's no such thing as the neutral teacher, recognizing that we take our histories and our experiences, our biases and our insights into the classroom with us. And so anti-bias education to me is sort of saying, well, you have to pay attention to that. You have to understand the impact of that, both in helping you maybe to be more culturally relevant, but also understanding the way, the set of glasses through which you are seeing children. The last thing I would say is, and this is maybe a good thing, but can also be a problematic thing, is that now with sort of NAYC, the National Association, essentially adopting the 4 anti-bias goals as part of their equity statement, and also including that language in developmentally appropriate practice, that it's anti-bias has sort of become, yes, we've done it, someone's putting in the chat, is that it's sort of become foundational knowledge. But there is a risk with that. First, we've already seen that now NAYC and developmentally appropriate practice, who would have thought it, are coming under attack as being woke and somehow a problem, right? So we have to be aware of that. The other thing I worry about too, now that it is in the sort of the canon, is that when something gets institutionalized, it can get watered down. So I think there's always this need, and I think Debbie and I recognize that with the film, of trying to push the envelope a little bit further, of going, okay, people are accepting some parts of this, but maybe it's not really enough. We're not there yet. We won't be there for a long time.
I think that, you've all talked about the fact that it is part of foundational knowledge now, that it exists, and the vocabulary is there, and also the concepts are there. People are more open-minded. Teachers and families are, many families are wanting it. And that's a big change from when the book first came out in 1989, when, the whole idea was kind of, people would say anti-bias education, what's that? Why don't you just say celebrate diversity? Why are you also talking about the fact that there's prejudice and bias, and children are colorblind and they don't notice and they're not prejudiced and so on? So from my perspective, we have made at least a first very important step. And now I think I'd rather be dealing with what you spelled out, John, than dealing with the fact that it was kind of invisible. The idea was invisible and not part of what you call the canon, the foundational knowledge of our field. So, but I also agree with you that I think Miliami was right, that we would probably not be facing the kind of organized opposition we are as anti-bias educators, but also, many people who are doing different forms of diversity, equity, bicultural education are experiencing this. We're not alone in this, but sort of the whole umbrella of what social justice education is experiencing the attack. And it is a pushback, I think, against the fact that we've become visible and we have become part of the canon. So what kind of experiences with this political pushback have you experienced? How has it been affecting you? And we'll start with Debbie again.
Well, I would say both painful and hopeful. It's painful to see the surge of hate, the divisiveness of the last, few years. I feel the election of President Trump in 2016 kind of opened the Pandora's box, and it's kind of like anything goes. And of course, it's not that there wasn't racism and hate before that, but it's much more public and permissible, it seems. It often feels like we're going backwards rather than forward. And teachers feel burdened. They're scared. They're intimidated. Their jobs are on the line. A lot of this by the recent educational gag laws. And at the same time, though, I think there's been a resurgence of resistance movements like Black Lives Matter. There's many more anti-bias and anti-racist webinars, resources, materials, a lot of it by Black, Indigenous people of color, developed by people of color. Organizations like Embrace Race come to mind to me, how they have, really offer all these wonderful tools and resources for free. And as we've already mentioned, our film, Reflecting on Anti-Bias Education in Action, the early years, it really is a privilege and honor to be part of that film in both creating it and connecting with the teachers. Yes, some from Karina's program. It really gave me a lot of hope. I feel they represent the teachers who do this work every day and how they put diversity and equity at the heart of everything they do. We've hoped that the film is a provocation to how you can bring this into your own programs. And we've seen that happen both in educational settings as well as with nonprofits and even business settings. You know, we often heard people say, well, if the kids can do it, you know, why can't we? And again, that the film was never meant to be, well, we need to copy it just like this, but rather here's something that's possible that can give us hope.
Debbie, can you put the name of the film and the
I'll make sure it gets in there. Yes.
some of the people have asked for it. Karina, what about you? What experience have you had with the pushback?
I would say for me, I haven't had too much pushback within our community here. At first, when we started receiving all those articles and reading about it, it was kind of hard because we are part of a consortium called Sound Childcare Solutions, and one of my sister's sites, Epiphany Early Learning here in, I believe it's the Madrona area, they were receiving a lot of hate around parts of the film that Debbie was mentioning. And to me, it made me really reflect on, you know, this world and where we're moving towards and all the hate that was brought up upon the teachings that we're doing with children when we're informing them of practices that are conversations that children are having in the classroom, excuse me. So to me, those brought conversations into our table with my staff that participated in the film to make sure of, you know, how did they feel, what support did they need, to make sure that we collectively work together to see how we were going to come up with a scenario if something were to come up. Fortunately, we didn't have anything come up within our settings. And I would say that a lot of it is we don't have a lot of pushback necessarily that is very upfront within our community. I do have a couple every so often with some families or some colleagues of mine. And that is just deeper conversations that we would have to go around to see what is causing this disequilibrium within yourself, what is the pushback, how can we come to an understanding of supporting the children, that I'm not really pushing this agenda to you. So to me, it's really being on the same page, and thankfully we haven't experienced too much of the pushback just because we've been in an area where the anti-bias education is really needed and it's embraced, I would say.
John?
Yeah, I just I've been watching the chat and wanted to do a shout out that has pointed out that it wasn't magic that anti-bias education became part of the educational, the canon of early childhood. And there was a lot of organizing, a lot of strategizing over many years, particularly by Black women within the NAYC organization. So I definitely want to recognize that. You know, I'm thinking back. First, this stuff has been going on for many, many, many years, right? And it's sort of morphed into a different and more problematic situation, I think, in response to the fact that the message is getting through and there's some visibility. I think back to when I was a young teacher in Australia, and it was very clear how homophobia operated in that time. In other words, there were legal things are going to happen. In fact, you would be fired from being a teacher. I remember my very first job, I found out afterwards that they'd done a background check on me at a time when it was not legal to do that. So those things have happened in terms of trying to keep people quiet, people of color, LGBTQ folks, for a long time. But I think that when I think about that, the first thing I think about is your vulnerability that you feel. When I was a teacher, the vulnerability of my job. When I was a director, the vulnerability to how people who object or have a strong opposition might bring that to licensing, for instance. And that did happen to me, where a parent who was having an issue around books being very inclusive of families, and particularly LGBTQ families, he was very strategic in what he did. And I think that's what's happening, is a lot of these groups are very strategic. He knew to go to a radio person, a right-wing radio station, and see if they'd pick up the story. He knew somehow how to find my diploma and find problems with it or something. And he knew to contact licensing. He knew to contact NAYC. So you can feel very vulnerable in those situations where people have these strategies to respond and to push back. And in that situation, I don't see any possibility for dialogue in that case. These are folks who are looking to return to things, the status quo, right? White supremacy. I think also that I find myself increasingly talking to teachers now as someone working in the university about the rights of children and the idea of our ethical responsibility to children and families to do no harm. And I think it's scary for teachers because they do, they see their job being threatened. They see their freedom to be able to teach the way they want being threatened. But it does come down to some ethical choices. And the thing that always amazes me is that the people who are prepared to take the most risks are the folks who are more subjected to bias and oppression in the society. So for me as a white man, I think that I have to reflect on that and think about, why aren't I prepared to take those risks? Well, it's because that privilege is there for me. So I think that's something I think about a lot. And I think the other thing that teachers are encountering is one of the narratives that is being thrown is that this is all about parental rights. And, somehow that's the argument for pushing against diversity, equity, and inclusion policies. And I think that's very confusing for some teachers because they believe in engaging parents. And so why would I be against parental rights? So I think that's something we need to address too.
As just to sort of finish that question, when the book was first attacked after it came out, so that would be the first book came out in 1989, and then in 1990 we were attacked by what was then called the Christian right, as the book being anti-Christian. And but the interesting thing about that is that I was supported then, or people from the more progressive, if you'd say, and from the Christian world of the United States. I'm Jewish. I had no contact with that before, and there was a whole new world of early childhood education opened up to me personally as a place to disseminate and to discuss and to talk about the ideas. Sort of that there was a large number of Christian programs in early childhood education who actually supported the anti-bias work, so that it isn't an either or issue. So I mean, getting attacked isn't great, but it also opens up those possibilities. So I want to move us then to what do we do? And that there are many different strategies. We're not going to talk about all of them, but the first one I want to talk about is to keep informed about what's happening and be prepared to counter misinformation and the arguments that diversity and equity, anti-bias work harms children. And actually, John started to talk about them. So I think there are two major arguments, not only two, but two that are really important for us to deal with. One is that anti-bias education makes children uncomfortable and makes them feel badly about themselves. And therefore we shouldn't be doing it. There's very even explicit language about that in the Florida laws that ban certain books. However, no explicit mention of the background of children who are being harmed are ever discussed. But we can make an inference from the fact that almost all of the books, if not all of the books in curriculum being forbidden in schools, are about people of color and Black people and Indigenous people and members of the LGBTQ+ community. So it gets to be pretty clear that the opposition argument is really talking about white children being uncomfortable, but without any mention being made of the children whose lives and histories are made invisible by book banning and the sadness that they and their families feel. So basically the opposition the argument boils down to why children who live in heterosexual families cannot feel sad or uncomfortable about the realities of children different from them, but all the other children can. And that I think we have to deconstruct that argument about that children are being harmed and feeling sad. And I think the second part of deconstructing that, it really is okay for kids to feel sad about things that hurt other people. That's one of the important pieces of early childhood education, that we are helping children develop empathy and developing to care about other people just as other people are going to care about them. And that can mean some sadness, but we also counter sadness by helping children learn about ways that they can stand up against unfairness and things that they can do and that other people are doing, and that children have a tremendous amount of resilience. And so it doesn't hurt if kids are feeling a little bit sad about things that actually morally we should be feeling sad about. So that's one argument I think that we need to prepare ourselves to deal with and to understand. The second one is what John alluded to, is that opposition to anti-bias education is about parents' rights, implying that all parents that we ever will encounter are opposed to anti-bias education. But in reality, as Karina mentioned, there are a whole lot of parents who care very much about it and see this as creating a community, a safe community where their kids belong and are visible and are learning about their identity. And it's creating a community that many people want, that teaches their kids what it means to be empathetic and caring and to stand up for justice. So in reality, I think the parents' rights arguments boils down to parents who do not want woke books and curriculum have parent rights, but everybody else doesn't. It sort of parallels the issue about which kids are made sad and which are not. And I think we have to be prepared to explicitly say what these arguments really mean and who are they really about, and to remind each other and people that we work with that there are many people who do not want books banned, who do not want diversity and equity issues removed from the schools. So that's one strategy. That's kind of a bottom line strategy, to stay informed and be able to deal with the arguments and the misinformation. So another strategy is to discuss opposition issues with your teachers and staff. And John was going to speak to that one.
Yeah, this is, of course, far ranging. And I think a lot of these things happen before that situation arises, so that you are proactively working with your teachers, with that learning community of teachers around what is the mission and what is anti-bias education, and having ongoing and critical discussions so that you can address issues such as folks who are in denial around difference or don't have access to developmental knowledge about children's capacity to understand oppression and diversity. So I think that's sort of the starting place. And part of that, I think, is really having a solid commitment to a mission, an articulate and explicit mission that teachers are on board with and have been part of constructing. Interestingly enough, that parent I was referring to who had a problem with what we were doing brought that mission statement to a parent meeting and said, well, it's not signed by every teacher every year, so therefore it's not enacted, which was really interesting, that he could see that this was a powerful document. So then, of course, we did go through a process of really keeping it alive and reflecting on that mission statement. I think the other thing is to think about just sort of the regular performance assessments that you have of teachers. You've got an anti-bias mission, you have goals around this. This is an important part of children's education, and so it should be part of the goals that teachers establish, and that you are able to assess teachers on and hold them accountable to the work of the school. So I think that can be an explicit part of what's going on. I think you also, as a director, have to figure out, where is this teacher coming from? Is this an issue where you can identify that they're at a particular, what I would say, developmental stage in their own understanding of their identity, and it's something you can work with, and that you can connect them to other people in that community of teachers? Or is it something where it's simply not going to work in your school? And of course, again, that gets back to how are you hiring teachers and what's the process you go through to make sure that they understand the approach you're taking. But, you know, sometimes it could be an issue around their own fear, their own concerns, their own sense of vulnerability that's at play. I think the other thing that's really helpful is making sure that you have a program, and this is sort of gets into talking about families, but where families are in leadership positions and able to have their voice. And I think that's important to the community of teachers to see what you're saying, Louise, that it's not as if all families have a problem with this. In fact, there's always a lot of support for that, and you can work with it. I personally, when I was a director of a program, I think it's important to be very transparent about your approach. I don't believe in a kind of a stealth approach to anti-bias education. I think it's always going to work in the longer term. It's always going to work if you're able to be very transparent about that and build your allies and look for your allies amongst the staff, around the community, and amongst the family members. And that's going to help you when opposition comes up from teachers in your own program. Yeah.
Okay, Karina, this will be segue into talking about working with parents, families, and building partnerships.
Thank you. For me, I would say it starts quite a bit with a lot of the negotiation and collaboration that you do with the families at the beginning. And one of the things that John mentioned was the transparency. I believe in transparency. I have myself 3 personal children, and I would want to put my children at a place where I knew what the curriculum, the philosophy, the mission, the vision, the values was. And one of the things that our school stands for is really families understanding where they're going to send their child to school. And that is through really having that collaborative approach from the time that they enroll, like the reason why they're enrolling into our program. Why did you choose our program? So our program is the Seattle Preschool Program, funded through the Seattle Preschool Program. So some families come to us because it's free, because they like anti-bias, the dual language aspect. So they come to us for different reasons. And to me, being a center director and an advocate for the children of our community, I feel that it's important for me to know the reason why families join our preschool. From there, it's really diving deep into the mission of our program and the curriculums that we have, but really talking about the 4 anti-bias goals. So they're aware of how they're seen throughout our practices within our chef, when meals are prepared, our hiring practices, our curriculum, our environment, our conversations. And from there, it's really having that a negotiation dance. And why did you choose our program? And then they share their values, and then we share our values. And one thing that I've learned in this practice of me doing a lot of anti-bias work within myself and in my program is that I can't let go of who I am to be able to work with anti-bias. I really have to know who I am to be able to support this work. And over the years, I've had to negotiate with families when things are being said to me that are not the most appropriate. And I say, you know, myself as a woman from Mexico, this is not the way that I am treated in my culture. So in order for us to work in a collaborative relationship, this is what we need to do. So I think at the beginning, if we're having those hard conversations, it's really putting that out there and saying, this is what it is. And sometimes it is difficult to have those conversations. I would say that the other thing that is really helpful is them understanding how it's seen within the practices of the curriculum, and for the teachers to be informed of what the administration is doing to tour families, as well as for them to be able to say and articulate what they mean. So then children, when they go home and say things, and then the parents come and then the teachers don't know what to say, I think it's really, what is the partnership that we have with the teachers, the families, and the children? Because then that way we're going to be able to back up everybody up, and we're not going to have any situations where, oh, they said it this, you're saying it like this, or this is what we believe in. And I think that has really supported our community, because I do have families that say, when you start talking about this type of family structure, I want you to let me know so I don't send my child to school. So with that, we have other conversations around how we're going to handle that. Certain holidays holidays that we celebrate that some families don't celebrate, specifically around Dia de los Muertos. So for that, it's what are we doing to inform some of the practices that we have through very transparent conversations, so that everybody feels valued, validated within our community, and it's not we're just pushing one agenda down. I think we've been very fortunate enough to really expose an anti-bias within our forefront since Southwest Early Learning Bilingual Preschool started back in 2008. And I feel that that has been rooted within our vision and mission, that families really seek that for their children to be aware. And for example, I myself came here in the 90s, and a lot of that was just speak English, let go of, being Karina, become Karina. And I think that's something that Swell is known for, is really helping to validate who we are within our identity, within our practices, so children can grow up and still live in this very diverse world without having that taken away from them. And I feel like that's one thing that the families really honor. It's a lot of that negotiation and dancing back and forth with the families that are opposed to some of the anti-bias work that is done. But I feel a lot of that is really making sure that we are knowing the families from the beginning, accepting them the way that they come, and really facilitating those conversations within the classroom. And one thing that has been very successful with us is really having community cafe parent gatherings. And it's really putting questions out there that parents can go in between tables to really be able to answer those questions without being judged on what they're writing. And I think that's something that has helped our growing community, where not everybody speaks one certain language. So I think that really has helped with the whole opposition of, caring for anti-bias work.
Okay. So Debbie, you're going to talk about connecting with other teachers and program leaders in the community as part of sustaining work and getting support.
Yeah. Social justice work, this stuff can be isolating, can be lonely, it can be frustrating and hopeless. So it's important to find your people. These could be your colleagues, these could be other family members, could be people in your community or people outside your community when things are tough. And I also believe it can happen on the local level as well as on the national level. So I wanted to share two examples of this. So locally, during the pandemic, I collaborated with director Julie Bisson, who is also one of the directors that we interviewed for this new edition of the book. She's a director of the Epiphany Early Learning Program in Seattle. And she and I started an anti-bias, anti-racist early childhood working group. We meet on Zoom monthly. And the idea was that anyone could come who's involved with anti-bias, anti-racist work in early childhood, and to share their dilemmas, their anti-bias dilemmas, their questions, their problems, bringing curriculum samples in or examples to get feedback on. And the idea was that we meet for around an hour, 90 minutes. And the first part is a whole group provocation that could come from the group. And then would break up into communities of practice and affinity groups to kind of have small group discussion on whatever the provocation is. And it's been amazing. We're going, I guess, into our 4th year of doing it. Here we just see who would be interested. And we've had early childhood educators from all different roles. So you've had teachers, we've had directors, we've had higher ed faculty, we've had coaches and mentors, as well as people who work with families, family groups, family advocates. So I feel that's really showing an example of the power of networking on the local level, so you don't feel as isolated. On the national level, we've already talked about the National Association for the Education of Young Children, NAYC. I wanted to share right after, we're also already mentioned, after the attacks on DAP and the ousting of Dr. Barbara Cooper from her position as the director of early childhood education in the state of Alabama, the People of Color Caucus, which is under NAYC, one of their groups, started mobilizing and started meeting, very concerned, and what can we do, pushing the organization a little bit, talking to them more about it. And what we found is that the group continued to meet actually a couple times a month. And it's ended in, we're actually going to be meeting in person at the national conference, which is in 2 weeks in Nashville. And we're having a session, kind of what we're calling a teach-in on the culture wars. So I think while it started first, the group coming together, a national group for looking for support for each other, it's moved into kind of, well, you know, an action, an activist type of group to think about that. And it's brought people from the actually affiliates, you know, we've had conversations with many different groups about that. I think also we already mentioned national organizations that have resources like we've already said something about Embrace Race. There are many others, right? Learning for Justice, Teaching for Change, Rethinking Schools, where we want to get, which Louise talked about in the very beginning, we need that accurate information. So when we hear things, we need to prepare ourselves to know how to respond. So I think we need, where do we get that information? There are resources out there and to look for them. And it's really about not doing this alone. When we stand together and unified, we support ourselves as well as moving the movement forward. I know that I'm seeing a lot of good questions in the chat, so I wanted to end kind of my thoughts on this about being an activist and mobilizing together with some words from Grace Lee Boggs. Her writings give me a lot of inspiration. She's a Chinese-American civil rights and labor activist who spent her life doing cross-racial organizing work between Black and Asian communities in pursuing racial justice by looking for those common issues, committing to collective action, and nurturing ongoing resistance. So I'll share that. This is the quote I wanted to share. "We never know how our small activities will affect others through the invisible fabric of our connectedness. In this exquisitely connected world, it's never a question of critical mass. It's always about critical connections." Check her out if you're not familiar with her.
Well, I mean, we could go on for quite a long time about this discussion, and including the question that I noticed in the chat about, you know, how the rights of people who disagree with the anti-bias work also get met. And I think, you know, what I'm hearing is that we do this, we make sure that people's needs are met by having transparency, by having deep relationships, by having conversations about the hard issues. And I'm assuming we negotiate solutions, and the specific solutions to specific disagreements will happen differently in different programs. But it doesn't mean so it doesn't mean that we are going to ignore people who have differences with us. But on the other hand, people who are opposing an anti-bias approach or an equity approach by simply banning books or curriculum are also not negotiating. They're saying it has to be my way or the highway. And I think what I hear from all three of you is that you're not working that way. You are working to really continually have discussion and relationships that enable you to look at the issues, that enable you to work together to stand for what you think is morally and ethically right and best for kids, and at the same time be continuing a conversation with all the different pieces, components, people in your early childhood program. So I think, Emily, I'm going to turn this back to you now to raise questions that people.
Can I just say, I just wanted to add one thing onto what you were just saying, Louise, because I think there is this sort of confusion that an anti-bias approach means anything goes or something. And, you know, I think we are part of our work in anti-bias is being aware of our non-negotiable values, you know, that we are inclusive, that we're going to respect the visibility of every child in the classroom. Those kinds of things are sort of a bedrock, and they're not, someone doesn't have the right to come in and oppress someone or to ask you to enact some kind of exclusive policy that's going to work for them. So I think that is important. And there are sometimes teachers get kind of confused between sort of some sort of liberal idea that everything, you know, sort of ultimate democracy or something, with the idea of negotiating around the inclusion of everyone, negotiating around importance of equity. And the other thing I would say is, as part of all this whole pushback, is really knowing what the real laws are and what the real licensing requirements are, because sometimes we invent in our own mind these fears that in fact aren't real in our particular community. They are. There's 19 states now that have laws on the books, and are probably many, many districts. But I think it's very important to be aware of exactly what is the limitation that you have in your community.
I agree. Thanks.
Wonderful, wonderful. It's been such a great conversation so far. I think one of the things that was kind of on my mind as you were speaking just now, John, about how it's non-negotiable to know your values in anti-bias education. It reminded me of what you said earlier about being very transparent in your beliefs. And there was a question about that that came in a little while ago. Lindsay Beatty was asking, would you say the same would go for individual pre-K to 2 teachers in public schools when it comes to transparency around your belief in teaching with an anti-bias approach? For example, when parents don't have a choice when it comes to who their children are placed with.
I mean, I think definitely public school is where things are very different, because they're subject to district requirements. And I was just looking at the Zin Education Project, which I encourage people to look at, which is connected to teaching for change. And there were, teachers talking about the books are being removed. I'm not allowed to teach this. So I'm not saying I do think you have to approach things with some creativity and strategizing about pushing the boundary of what you can do in terms of anti-bias work. I mean, I'm not saying that people should unwittingly lose their job, right? But I do think that that somehow thinking you can keep it hidden when you really need the support of the parents and you need the support of the colleagues and you need the support of administration. I don't think that's going to work on the long term. It might mean that you're able to do something in your curriculum that no one knows about. But ultimately, if you want those children to go home and talk about those things and engage in a dialogue and have parents supporting what you're doing, I think you are going to have some kind of transparency, but you're going to have to do that smart and make sure you're aware of arguments like the wonderful governor of Alabama, who I'm being facetious, who fired Dr. Cooper, was saying, well, we don't have time for this woke stuff because our children need to learn mathematics and become literate. Well, we have to flip that argument around and say, absolutely. When you are talking about human diversity and anti-biases, you're engaging children in very complex problem solving and thinking and expansion of knowledge and being able to read. All of those skills are going to happen. So we have to be able to be ready to say, oh no, it's not taking a place of that. In fact, this is a way of engaging children or more depth in their education. So we have to be ready with those kinds of arguments. And I think also documenting what you're doing and being very public about that and getting support of the community groups could only help you in being able to do that work.
Yeah, I would say also, particularly even in the public schools, pre-K to 2, if children are talking about it and bringing it into the classroom, you could frame it that way. I've seen public school teachers use that approach. Well, so they try to talk about, this has come up in the classroom and brought up at meeting time. Here's what kids are thinking about. Here's what I said. So it's a way that it's not like being, it's coming from the children, and that's part of what our job is. And we need to respond to them authentically and listen to them carefully. And you can share what you did, what the teacher, here's how we responded, here's how the teacher responded, and what do you think? So starting that dialogue, opening that up. But sometimes that's one of those, what I call the kind of going by, swinging in through the children.
I think that, to pick up on what John was saying also about being strategic. And one of the things we discuss in the Leading Anti-Bias Early Childhood programs is this idea of sort of the 3 A's, where when there is someone who is disagreeing with what, it starts with transparency. And then when someone disagrees with you, going through a process of finding out what is it that you disagree with? What in your experience influences your disagreement with it. And now here's my point of view, what's in my experience, why I believe that way. And how can we come up with what we call the third space? It may not be what the teacher originally wanted to do, and it isn't going to be what the parent doesn't want anything about that topic, but there's a third space where both can agree to that deals with some aspects of diversity and equity, and that fits the community that you're working in. So it's not an either or approach, but it's how do we find where there's common ground around fairness and the kids' needs, and find a solution that can work, that we can all live with. And in fact, many of the times, I really believe we can find those solutions. It takes courage on the part of the teacher to do that, and willingness to really listen, and it takes time. And even, structurally, that's often something that people in public schools don't have, to work with parents, but it is a requirement. It's really a necessity to be able to work out some of these issues.
Great, great. We had a number of questions come in earlier during the webinar related to working with families and building relationships and that sort of thing. And I think some of them came while you were speaking, Karina. So maybe I'll just read a couple of these, and you can just reflect on the issues that the attendees are raising. Liz asks, how do you involve families as leaders in ECE centers and schools? Sarah asks, what about when parents treat other parents in threatening ways? And Maura is asking about, what if you have a parent who's a white supremacist, the child hears what the parent says, what's the best way to, approach that parent relationship? Do you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, I can start with the last question around when parents have some thoughts and then they go into the classroom and then it's lunchtime and we're having those conversations. I would say that one key aspect of doing this work is having uncomfortable moments, and we're going to have growing pains. And as a center director, and having that relationship with the families is really being honest with them, that part of our values are this, and this is some of the conversations that we heard during lunchtime. And if we can not shut those conversations down necessarily, but what can we do to not have some of those hurtful conversations be happening in the classroom where other children are feeling sad about those conversations. And this happened specifically around the last 2 elections ago, and a lot of those conversations were happening. So I would say it comes down to being transparent with the families of what's happening within the classroom community, what kind of conversations are happening. Specifically, if you have children that don't speak English as their first language, you want to make sure we're being careful with that. But also, it's the whole transparency with families that guides you to this powerful work and moving forward. And I would say that's what's been very successful to us. And then I forgot the first question.
I know I threw a lot at you there. I just it seemed like people were kind of circling around this idea of what it's like to work with families. So the other questions were, how do you involve families as in ECE centers, just kind of generally, I think. Okay. And what about have you encountered a situation where parents treat each other in threatening ways?
Mm-hmm. I would say the first thing is working with parents in them as a first teachers and learning from them, getting the experience and gaining that experience from them, and seeing what are their beliefs and values around anti-bias education. And then from there, slowly putting in some gems of how this is seen within our practice. That has been quite successful with us, and really doing a whole understanding of the reason why they chose the school. And from there, having different presentations around the curriculum that you have, the philosophy, the teaching values of each teaching team. So we really do quite a bit of making sure that our learning is visible for everyone, specifically for the families, because they send their children to our school. So from there is once the learning is visible, whether it's on the wall, documentation, during conferences, formal or informal, I think that really helps bring the parents to understand the philosophy a little bit more and understand the anti-bias values and goals in a deeper way, not just, they talk about it. Once we start talking about this topic, I'm going to get offended. No, it's really, they really understand that. And I think that's something that has helped us quite a bit, is really bringing the families as part of our curriculum, engaging them in those hard conversations. And then in regards to families, if they are being hurtful with one another, we've only experienced it a handful of times. And it's really having that observing aspect first and kind of observing the dynamics, and then depending where it's going, then it's really stepping in. And to me, I'm a very transparent educator, so it's connecting with them and letting them know that in this space, this is where we feel safe, and in order for us to have a safe space, we need to be vulnerable. And if what they believe in makes you feel a little bit uncomfortable, then let's have conversations around this. So to me, it's really bringing groups together, whether it's families or teachers or children together, to have setting the topic in the middle and saying, how can we grow from this, has been very impactful.
Yeah, I was so glad you said that, Karina, about the creating the culture for doing this work. That's a key part of the leader's role. You know, how do we create that space that's both safe and brave, where people can, and taking risks. And it's okay to make mistakes and fall down and get up, and leaders modeling that. I think that helps create that climate for people really sharing and deeply understanding each other. I think the other question, Emily, you said was something about leaders. How do you encourage parents to be leaders? Someone asked about that. The one thing that came to my mind on that one was, again, with this risk taking, for leaders to be willing to share the space, willing to share, you know, if you call it power or sharing responsibility for meeting the mission and the goals of our program with this anti-bias focus. How do we share that with families? How do we empower them to take on these leadership roles? It can start small, but then it can become larger. But I think often leaders are afraid to do that because they're holding the reins. I'm going to control it. So if we can let go a little bit and take a risk ourselves, right, and let families take on some responsibility and leadership.
I mean, it seems to me that what we're saying, to add to the very first question about what are the successes and how, you know, some of the new ideas and vocabulary in the early childhood canon, is the definition of what's a safe space. And the idea that a safe space is a brave space, and it may not always be comfortable, and it may not always be everybody's friends, and we have no disagreements, you know, sort of, we're not all nice with each other all the time, but that the kind of spaces we're talking about, brave spaces, or where diversity can exist and different ideas can exist, and hard conversations about diversity and inequity, and whether it's systemic and institutional inequity or individual interpersonal issues, all of that can exist as part of safety, because it has to be safe for everybody, not just for one piece of the population. And maybe that needs to be added to our successes in the canon, not just us. I mean, we're not the only ones saying this, but that in early childhood has special significance, because we have been so attached to the idea that everything is smooth and nice and nobody gets rattled or upset. Well, this work is not like that. Because for me, I think about this oppression and the racism and the sexism and so on is not nice. It has hurt people terribly. And trying to change that, to change all the attitudes and behaviors that go into it, sometimes opens up hurts. It opens up wounds. It opens up anger. It opens up discomfort. And we have to be brave enough to find ways to keep a conversation going with each other, even in those times. And that's all. I think we're running out of time.
We are indeed right at 6 o'clock. Thank you all so much for your responses to those questions about working with families. John, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Oh, sorry. What I was thinking about as leading off what Karina was saying about, you know, the parent who might have saying, well, at home, I'm going to be a white supremacist, or I'm going to be a homophobic parent, or whatever it is that one of the arguments about anti-bias education that the right likes to do is that somehow it's propaganda and indoctrination. Well, actually, it's not. We're trying to engage children in children's curiosity. We're trying to engage children in making sense of the world around them. So I think, for me, I think we always have to be careful in anti-bias education. We're not taking that top down and saying, we're going to teach you the way it is. But in fact, what we're doing is building off the questions children have and provoking their curiosity about the world around them and issues like fairness. It's not simply saying, we're going to give you this this package, and that's all there is to it. So I think that children, again, their capacity is their ability to go home and see, why are people talking about it this way? Why is it being talked about in a different way? And we don't have control over everything that children take out of that. They're active in this process, and we do what we can to support them in that process of making sense of fairness and unfairness in the world.
Great. Thank you so much. We're at the end of our time, so I think that'll be it. I'm sorry that we didn't get to everyone's questions. But I want to thank our engaged, wonderful audience for being here with us. I want to thank our panelists for their time and their expertise. Yeah, thank you so much for your time. This was a wonderful hour. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Carry
Thank you.
on. Great work.